Kate Falcher, welcome back. This is Irish Granny Tarot. This is our Saturday book. This is video number 2, Escaping from Eden by Paul Wallis. I hope everybody agrees. Fascinating book. So before we start, I do want to show you another book. I've mentioned this book a zillion times and I can never find it. And in my search for something else I'm going to show you in a minute, look what was hiding with it. Yahweh, the Two-Faced God. Now, this is subtitled Theology, Terrorism, and Topology by Joseph P. Farrell. Joseph P. Farrell is one of the hardest authors I've ever read. This is the kind of book, and I don't want to put people off of it. It's really a good book. But this is the kind of book where you read a paragraph, you understood every single word in the paragraph, but you have no idea what you just read. Then you go back and read it again. And it's not because it's poorly written. It's well written. It's just so dense, and it expects real engagement from the reader. It's not something you'd read as light entertainment, but if you want to stretch your brain cells, this is the book for you. It's a really good book. But let's return to the subject at hand, Escaping from Eden. And we had just ended video number 1 at the end of chapter 3. So now we're on chapter 4, a lot of forgetting. So the author explains that by simply pluralizing the meaning of one word, Elohim, the Bible takes you back to much older texts. And he points out in Genesis, chapter 4, I believe, the kinds of plural entities, the Elohim, the Ben Elohim, and then there are humans and Nephilim. And also in cuneiform sources, there are ETs, which would be analogous to gods, humans, and then hybrids. So let me see what I thought was important here. This is what he's telling his friend. He's got a friend who's a pastor and a scholar, and they're arguing this whole thing, and his friend's name is Brad. He says, Brad, it doesn't just look like a plural, the word Elohim. It behaves like one, too, in context. It's got plural form, plural verbs, plural behaviors, plural agendas, plural moralities even, and as soon as you repluralize that word Elohim, the biblical stories begin to make sense, and then the anomalies stop being anomalies. So his friend argues, how could such a huge thing as ETs creating humans just be forgotten? And he said, truth's obscured. It's obscured by the sands of time. He says, go back and look at the movie Planet of the Apes. We did a book last year, but well, maybe earlier this year, about Alexandria, and Stefan Schwartz wrote the book. Lovely man, and he's willing to come back and talk with us. I'm waiting for exactly the right topic to pick his brain. He took remote viewers into the deserts of Egypt, and they found an entire city that had been lost in the sands of time, buried under sand. It was a port city on the Nile. The Nile changed course over the years, you know, plate tectonics, etc., etc. The Nile changed course, and the port city lost the ability to be a port, and the economy collapsed, and people moved away, and the city died. And for a very long time, nomadic Bedouin tribes would go in and camp there or keep their sheep there or whatever. But over time, even that was forgotten. And sand moves constantly. You know, it can be very dangerous. You know, it creates dunes very quickly where there was nothing before. And it covered the city, and it was completely forgotten to history. And there are mentions of it, which is why they knew maybe somewhere there should be something to look for. There were no landmarks. There was no way to know. There was no accurate surveying that they could refer to. It took remote viewers out there and they found it. It's a fascinating story, but it's a perfect example. Things get lost. The original harbor wall, you know, of the city of Alexandria was lost until he took his remote viewers to Alexandria, and they knew it was out there somewhere in the water. They just didn't know where. It was lost to time. So the author, Wallis, points out that a professor was fired from Colgate just for telling the story, excuse me, of the Sumerians. And look what happened to John Mack from Harvard Medical School, teacher and clinical psychiatrist, who, very strange situation. He got asked by the military. Let me read this. And he had, just as a matter of fact, as a little aside note, he had won the Pulitzer Prize for his book on Lawrence of Arabia. So he was the head of clinical psychology, and until the 1990s, the U.S. military, they invited him, John Mack, to do psychiatric assessments of military personnel who had filed reports about close encounters with ETs. And he noticed unusual patterns. He looked further. He widened his sample to include civilians and then talked to people who claimed that they'd been abducted. And when he brought his report back to the military, he said something's going on that can't be explained as a psychological phenomenon. These people are experiencing something that we need to look into. And the moment he put that into the public domain, the authorities jumped into action to destroy him. He was intimidated. His job was threatened. He was ridiculed in the press. They threatened to take away tenure. He had to bring in top legal counsel just to keep his job. The message was clear, and it was a warning to a lot of people in positions of academia and science. So anyway, he says, forgetting is rewarded, remembering is punished. That's how things get lost. For example, Marcion, an early Christian theologian, pointed out the dissonance between the angry Old Testament God, Yahweh, and the God of Jesus, who was loving and forgiving. And he said this is incompatible. And 90% of the religious scholars of the time agreed with him. But Origen, that's the name of a guy, Origen, he came along and he made excuses. He twisted himself into pretzels to try to make sense of it. And he told them how to reinterpret the Old Testament God to fit the narrative of the rest of the Bible. But they both, Origen and Marcion, both said, there's an incompatibility. One of them challenged it. The other tried to make excuses for it. And because they addressed it differently, Marcion was rejected for challenging the status quo. Origen became the Orthodox belief system, and Marcion was excommunicated. And despite his 90% agreement from other people. And he believed that the Elohim were not God, that they were ETs. And he said this, and that was real popular. And his followers in Asia Minor believed him for over 500 years. He was believed. He wasn't conventional mainstream Christian orthodoxy. They went the other way with Origen. But Marcion, that story that these are not gods, these are aliens, resonated for early people in Asia for a very long time. But he was excommunicated. All of his writings were destroyed. To my knowledge, there's nothing left. You cannot read what he wrote. So this is how we forget. Remembering is an act of courage, an act of rebellion. Paul Wallis's friend says that it's all just very old fiction, great stories, but they're not real. And Wallis argues examples of modern fiction that are based on very real truth. The Madness of King George is a good example. Downfall, which I wish I had, which I watched, is the fictionalized story of Hitler's secretary, and it's based on real documents, and it's really well done. And I don't know where I saw it. I can't remember. When I read the book, I sought out the movie, and it's quite well done. You get to see what went on in Hitler's bunker, These ancient stories we're not completely 100% forgotten. So his question, which I think a lot of people have posed, is mythology just early history? Most believers of Christianity know virtually nothing of the earliest struggles between the first theologians of Christianity and alternate views. They don't know. A lot of people don't realize that it was 400 years after the death of Christ, plus 400 plus, before the Christian church voted on things like reincarnation and women in the church. And it's not all that well. They don't want you to know. So there's a tendency to brush away other interpretations, to blindly accept mainstream doctrine. Orthodoxy, right? Orthos means right in Greek. And doxa means opinion. So orthodoxy is the right opinion. Doesn't mean there aren't other opinions. Now, which is what I wrote on the next, the next line. So this happens all the time in history. For example, and this is one of my favorites, the British royal family. They're German. They're not British. They're German. And at the outbreak of World War I, they changed their name. Their like family name, was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But things were not looking very good for Germany. Germany wasn't popular in World War I with the British, and they wanted to stay on the right side of the people. So they changed their name to Windsor. And Windsor wasn't a person. Windsor was a building. But they changed their name to seem more English. And then 20 years later, members of the royal family, like the guy who quit, you know, for the woman he loved, and the divorcee, is so shocking, right? They lived outside Paris with their own private SS guards to protect them from the war. They were real pro-Nazism. Allegedly, according to history. I don't want to get in trouble here. So, and I didn't agree with it. I still don't. So the rejection of the culture of Babylon and Sumeria, they were oppressors. The Babylonians were oppressors, and people would want to suppress that history. It's painful and they don't want to remember it. Look what's going on today with the suppression of history. It's how some people think. And, you know, the people of the Bible were held in exile for 3 generations or more. And Genesis was edited as a reflection of that trauma. Preachers are always really careful to not stray from the official storyline. You just don't do that if you want to keep your pulpit. Anyway, Wallis decided to look for the vestiges of ancient heritage in museums and artifacts. And the next chapter is chapter 5, Knowing Our Bones. Now, I went downstairs here and got a couple of books to show you. I have these books, and half the time I don't know where they are or what I've done with them. But I did find this book. Now, why do I have this page marked? Well, I don't know. So this book is unbelievable, by a guy called Michael Cremo and another guy called Richard Thompson. It's called Forbidden Archaeology. And I just want to show you a little something. That's how much forbidden archaeology they were able to write about. And this is not the delusion of a couple of disgruntled academics or archaeologists or rebels or whatever, not counting the huge bibliography. This book is 828 pages long. It has a bibliography of almost 100 pages. So it's 910 pages long. And it's got drawings. I'll show you here. Let me find one that's interesting. It has drawings of fossils and bones that correlate with the narrative. And this is stuff they've come up with from museums all over the world. Museums, universities. There are some pictures in here, but maybe they're all drawings. I don't know. It's been a really long time since I read this book. skeletons, pottery, chips of bones, timelines. This is an interesting skull. And it just has item after item after item after item that's buried in museums and universities around the world because they're inconvenient to the mainstream narrative. And if you really want to dig into it, that's a very good book. And then I have this little tiny book, The Lost World of Giants. And this is talking about the giants from the Bible and modern day people who are extremely tall. And it has fossils of bones that are absolutely incredible. And then it goes through and it categorizes. It lists page after page after page of specific bones, sometimes mummies, sometimes full skeletons from all over the world. Once again, forbidden archaeology. Nobody knows how to explain it. You know, they talk about, oh, well, they wrap their babies' heads to make their heads that shape and to extend them up higher. Except that these skulls don't have the same number of plates, bony plates, as modern human skull has. Explain that one. Okay, I'm digressing, but it's just too much fun. So these guys, so Paul Wallis decides he's going to go on a hunt for this forbidden archaeology. He's not going to look for forbidden archaeology. He's going to see what the archaeology is and how it fits into the picture. So chapter 5, Knowing Our Bones, Peruvian skulls. And human skulls have been found that are huge. They're 60% heavier than modern skulls. The number of plates in the skulls are different. The brains would have, unless they were rattling around in an empty space, the brains would have had to have been 25% bigger than our brains. And the shape changed dramatically from those early bones, those early skulls, to the skulls today. And these exist. These are in Peruvian museums, Peruvian universities. Often not on public display, but they can be found if you have strings to pull. At first it was thought that these were artificial cranial deformations, that they molded babies' heads. But then they realized, okay, they don't have the same number of plates, you know, the facts that I just said. They were found in South America. They were found also in Egypt, the Alamein of Germany, the Alam of Iran, the Andean Nazca, and in the Caucasus. And we now know there was a subset of people who were born that way. And he cites versions of the appearance of modern man. Now, there are different interpretations of these steps in evolution. And he believes that things may have been shuffled to the side because they don't fit. In the 1990s in France, paleontologists found bones in a prehistoric village of two different types, Neanderthal and modern, but dating from the same period, allegedly. I'm not challenging conventional wisdom here. But forensic artists modified their drawings and accounted for these skulls, and suddenly the drawings of early man began to look uncannily modern. Wallis went on to visit college professor friend in England, and he was shocked to meet a foreign student who looked like the forensic drawings that had been done. And he realized that if you dig into different groups of people extant today, you realize that we don't really familiarize ourselves with everybody that's out there. He said that there is DNA, paleontology, and artifacts So 3 sources of evidence to support a diverse human population in ancient times. There was a lot of genetic intermingling that they were not really aware of before DNA. The belief in the extreme primitiveness has been dispelled when they found a body in the Tyrol. They found a guy they called Otzi, who was 5,000 years old. He was wearing well-made, fancy-stitched clothing with mixed textiles and insulation, not just, skins. He wasn't a caveman. He was wearing cobbled shoes. His teeth had been repaired. He had a pouch of crafted tools with him that were just like a pouch that a handyman would carry today. So how do we explain that kind of early sophistication in the context of what we've assumed thus far? And what about the sudden appearance in Sumeria of farming and irrigation and planned street grids and canals and sanitation and writing and math and banking and astronomy and timekeeping and artwork with a huge variety of beings depicted, large and small, that all appeared of a sudden in Sumeria. DNA discovered, the discoveries that they're making are now supporting the truth of these mythological descriptions of diversity. And he's including in that the stories that we have received down through the ages of giants, extremely tall people. But it's not just that they were really, really tall. Their skeletal structure was I'm not saying this guy, but what they found archaeologically, their skeletal structure was a little different too. And Pliny, in the early 100s AD, Roman guy, he wrote about a man he met from Arabia who was 9 feet 9 inches tall. Josephus, same thing. He said giants were real, that he'd met them. He claims they're the offspring of the powerful ones and human women. They describe battles with giants. But, well, there's the story of David and Goliath. There's one example. But they describe battles with giants that had 6 fingers and toes, that were descended from ancient alien blood giants. And Wallis talks about the battle in Joshua's time. At that time, there were still giants whose bodies were so large and whose faces were so different to normal people that they were shocking to look at and struck terror when you heard them. The bones of these men are still on display to this very day. This is Josephus speaking. That's a quote. So Josephus was... he considered Greek mythology not mythology. He considered, and he was a very respected, I guess, historian. He considered them histories, these mythologies. They weren't just fairy tales. They were an attempt to put a narrative to the real past. In Ohio, I couldn't read my handwriting. Otto, where is Otto? It's Ohio. In Ohio, they found giant skeletons 8 feet tall with 6 fingers and toes, and they found a jaw with all of its molars, with all of the teeth were molars, and they were dated. They were ancient. They weren't like modern anomalies. The same thing was found in Ecuador and Malta. This book, this forbidden archaeology. In Indonesia in 2004, they found people, real life people, that were very similar to a description of hobbits. They were extraordinarily small people in the Lingua Cave, an island of the Flores Islands. They were 1 meter tall. And, they're not real life people. I misspoke. They have descendants there. But these archaeological finds, they lived 18,000 years ago, dating the bones that they found. So these finds indicate prehistory and that very possibly our lineage, our descent, was not necessarily linear. There's so much contradictory evidence and questioning. And they've settled on a mainstream narrative, but there's constant new discoveries and new challenges to that. I'm not challenging the status quo. I'm just saying that there are a lot of people out there who have found a lot of very interesting things. Rh positive, Rh negative blood, it indicates different DNA lines might have existed. And different DNA lines that create separate breeding groups, that's the definition of a species. So is this assumption that Rh positive and negative existence indicates that? He's just postulating. The word species is Latin. Speculation is Latin. It means we're going to look at it. It doesn't mean fact. It means we're going to look at it. And lots of cave art supports side-by-side existences of some sort of divine being, as in biblical and mythological tales. The big question is, given the existence of these long skulls, and the agreement, the consensus is becoming that they occurred naturally. Why did some groups go to drastic lengths to alter the shapes of their babies' heads? Because that happened too. So the inference is they were copying these naturally born. Were these the leaders, and they were trying to mimic the leaders? The conquistadores went out of their way to wipe out all of this, but they actually said that they were wiping out the long-skulled people because they were considered indigenous royalty. So what the question he is inferring here, let's just be really clear about this, is that there were leaders of indigenous people who purported to be of not earthly full derivation, extremely tall, with elongated and oddly conformed skulls, different numbers of plates, different volume, implying larger brain. These were the leaders of the indigenous people in the far distant past, and some remained when the conquistadores came to the New World. And they intentionally got rid of them, singled them out, because they were a challenge to authority. They were the leaders of the people. The Spanish didn't want to deal with that. So this parallels Egypt during the Akhenaten's time, Nefertiti, King Tut, and R-shaped skulls were the servant class. Not much has changed in my life. The pharaohs are depicted with longer skulls. So Wallis says elegance and sophistication of, for example, in fashion today, do we have remnants of this? You wear your hair in a tall bun, and that's for formal events, an updo, but is there some atavistic recognition of elongated skulls as being a thing of leadership and sophistication and wealth? And I mean, it sounds a little funny at first, but when you think about it, our little monkey brains are so easily triggered by all kinds of stuff. Why wouldn't that be a reason? The lowbrow Neanderthal was considered socially inferior. The long-skulled people had 25% bigger brains. So are we talking about a legitimate difference in intelligence and being put to work? If you didn't have a big head, you get put to work. The DNA of long skulls is 100% human. What it shows is diversity. Where did the diversity come from? Because, if it's 100% human, that doesn't mean that humans weren't manufactured from somewhere else, you know. Part of our DNA gave that trait of long skulls. Where did that come from? That's the big question. So he tries to reconcile biblical timelines with anthropology and archaeology. Things like the flood, ice age. He says there's an interesting correspondence with an event 12,800 years ago. I'm hearing geese. 12,800 years ago, called the Clovis Comet. This was a near extinction event, and there actually was flooding and extermination of mass areas of any living thing because of this comet that was devastating. He says if you don't look at Genesis as a story of creation, divine creation, look at it more as an extinction event and recovery from near extinction. Starts to have a new light. So now let's do chapter 6, the great reemergence. Ancient Mayan creation account called the Popol Vuh, which translates into the People's Book, reads like Genesis. The earth was a dark sky. Everything was darkness. They go into it in more detail. The Mayans do. Why was everything in darkness? Because ash filled the sky. And the waters had a very high increase in sea level. The 2-mile thick ice shelf melted. And experts agree that this was what happened on the Earth after the Clovis Comet. This is exactly what happened, and the story is told in the mythology of the Popol Vuh. The comet caused wildfires and volcanoes, and ash and smoke went into the sky. It caused catastrophic floods. And there's a sedimentary level, layer over the Americas, Europe, and Western Asia that confirms this. They were able to study the content of this sediment all over those parts of those continents. The timing, the content confirm the story. The meltwater and the dark skies led to a cold period called the Younger Dryas. There was a super rapid ice age climate change, and the coastal waters rose about 200 feet on all the coasts. And in 2007, the sediment with evidence of massive mid-air comet explosions that ended prehistory, ended civilizations at that time, what they now call the Clovis civilization, and made extinct approximately 80% of the megafauna on the planet and about 36 species. So this is conventional science we're talking about here. There was a comet, there were people, there were civilizations, there was a comet, and the fire hit the earth and caused the earth to catch on fire because of its proximity. I'm not sure which. But the result of this comet, in a nutshell, was massive fires, tectonic activity, melting of the polar ice caps or ice sheets, and did I say fires, and ash in the air and lava causing smoke in the air. And it killed off enormous amounts of life on the planet, including the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, the mastodon, and the woolly rhinoceros. There's archaeological evidence globally of a number of city-states that suddenly stopped in their tracks. And one of them is Göbekli Tepe. And if you haven't seen this book is utterly fascinating, and I really recommend it. The Temple of the Watchers and the Discovery of Eden by Andrew Collins, with an introduction by Graham Hancock. I think it's almost time to do another Graham Hancock book. And it's got fantastic pictures and interesting stories and photographs. And you know I love a book with photographs, colored photographs of architecture and artwork that they cannot explain the sophistication or the engineering. That's just one picture and I won't dwell on it, but it's a fascinating story. I'm going to go back and look at the narrative of this book and see if it's appropriate for presenting. Sometimes books are really, really great to read, but they don't lend themselves well to a quick run through. So, all right. Göbekli Tepe. This is in Turkey, ruins in Turkey. And what's so interesting about it is a lot of the structures were semi-protected because the entire development, a city, whatever, the entire thing was completely and intentionally, carefully filled with rubble. Like they didn't leave until they covered the whole thing with rubble, you know, rock. And there's a maze of tunnels underneath it. And there are tunnels, supposedly, that go from Scotland to Turkey. I'm not even going to touch that. That's very interesting. People lived underground. They can tell that people lived underground. There are air vents and places for animals and anything that you would think of to do, all done underground. Why? Was the surface uninhabitable? Underwater. Now, Graham Hancock did a book about this, and it's a fascinating book. His wife and he learned underwater photography and scuba diving so that they could make that book. I'm going to find that book too. Underwater around Malta, coasts of India, Japan, and other places, there's evidence of engineered structures that were inundated. While studying pollution in the Gulf of Cambay in India, a city was found at 120 feet with walls, a street grid. It was a seaport, and this was the city of Dwarka, and it was previously only known about in myths. In Malta, they saw underwater vehicle tracks in stone. They begin on the land, but they extend 30 meters into the sea and under the water, and they're still under the water. These are not, naturally occurring things. These are tracks of vehicles, and they know because they connect to the tracks of vehicles on dry ground. In Japan, Yonaguni is 36 meters underwater. There are terraces, paths, gutters, pillars. So all of these were unmanned. Originally, they didn't build them underwater, and but they have not been above water for 12,000 years. So are these evidence of a cataclysm from which humans had to recover? Between 12,000 and 11,600 years ago, approximately, they think this happened. To survive, first the sky had to be cleared for the earth to be habitable. Then the land had to be reclaimed. Sounds like the first book of Genesis. Genesis even says that the earth existed with the oceans and it existed as a chaotic wasteland. So was Genesis even describing a post-cataclysmic planet after an extinction level event? Genesis describes what it would look like if a superior species landed to help a planet recover. I'm just saying. So first they would have to separate out the salt to get fresh water. They'd have to clear the air to get sunlight and make it breathable. And they would have to replace the flora and fauna of the surface. These are recurring themes in Mesopotamian accounts, in the Bible, in the Popol Vuh, and others. So a Dominican priest named Francisco Jimenez in early 18th century discovered the Popol Vuh, and he translated it from the Mayan into Spanish. And he liked the Mayan culture and was befriended by Mayan priests, and they told him of their mythology, which had not been known by Europeans. They told of the feathered serpent, and they were very clear in their stories, these Mayans, about what happened and who was doing it. So let's look at what that is about here. The Popol Vuh tells the story this way: all was immobility and silence. In the darkness, in the night, only the Creator, the former, the dominator, the feathered serpent, those who engineer, those who give being, hovered over the waters as a dawning light. That's a quote. So it's plural. They cleared the air. They gave light. People didn't show themselves until plants and animals returned. These were superior beings assisting the recovery from a cataclysm. All sources refer to the ongoing involvement of these superior beings. Did such a rescue happen more than once? And that's a really interesting thing to think about. There are those who believe that the story of the flood and Noah, that flood is one in a series of many similar cataclysms that occurred over and over in cycles. And yes, there was a comet, and and that may not necessarily have happened every time, but it was a handy tool to get it to happen. So, in a wider cosmic community, Wallis asks, are we sort of mid-level beings? Popol Vuh tells of a conference of superior beings. This is all scarily familiar. And they say to themselves, in the Popol Vuh, the Mayan book, let us try again. Let us make those who will be our avatars and those who will bring our food. So the engineers determined to make man. Of red earth they molded his flesh. And just FYI, Mayans were in South America. Is that right? Mexico? Oh my God, I'm so ignorant. They were over on the other side of the world. The Bible, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and eventually the Israelites, these people were in the Middle East. And never the twain shall meet, because there was no internet. There was no airplane travel. There was no connection between the two groups to our knowledge. So, just, similarities are very remarkable in that case, in that context. So, those are the superior beings having a conference. And that's just like in Genesis, it's almost the same words. They talk about, let us do this, let us do that, let us mold man from earth. Same stuff. Cuneiform tablets, same stuff. Humans were made to serve the more superior beings and to supply the food, which is why they were taught agriculture. I already read that. And they had been depleted in numbers by this chaotic event. And after they were wiped out, according to some of these stories, the only humans that remained had to live in the forests like apes, it said. It's interesting. So then they started over. They made four perfect men, progenitors, but they got too good. They were too good. They were too much like the gods themselves. We're still doing the Mayan story here. And so this council talked amongst itself, and of humans, they said, they have understanding. They will not want to remain subordinate. They'll want to make themselves equal to us. Let us therefore limit their sight. So they breathed a cloud over the pupil of the human's eyes, and their sight was darkened. metaphoric for like make them stupid? I don't know. So the head, I wrote head guy. It's not a professional term. The leader in the Popol Vuh of the elevated ones. His name was, in Mayan, the heart of the sky. Like Enlil, who translates the air lord. And Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent. He was the second in command. And he was like Enki, the lord of the earth. And also, I'm sure this has already occurred to you, has been associated with the snake in Genesis. In all these stories, he's the one who comes up with the final version of humans. And the Greek myths of Zeus and Prometheus are similar. They're parallel. Zeus was like the CEO, Enlil, and Prometheus was like Enki, their man on the ground. Prometheus took it upon himself to upgrade humans with technology of the time, which was fire. And Prometheus is very similar to the snake in Genesis. He's a trickster in the stories. And like Enki, he's associated with wisdom and science and technology. And all three of these characters were responsible for the upgrade that led to the downfall of humans. Zeus gets Prometheus to downgrade humans. They know too much. And then he punishes Prometheus. And once again, the CEO orders the downgrade from an upgrade that was given by a lower-ranking ET, if you want to look at it that way. So the story is consistent in all these different cultures. It's repeated through many cultures. We're just, in this book he says that, and he's just focusing on these ones that are richly documented. So in Eden, there was the snake. In the Popol Vuh, there was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And in the case of the snake power of Genesis, wait, I want to make sure I'm reading the right part here. All are involved in progressing the human experiment and specifically upgrading the intellectual capacities of human beings. Perhaps the most significant pattern that repeats across Genesis, the tablets, Sumerian, and Popol Vuh is that the emergence of modern humans is portrayed as the outcome of a series of experiments done in gradual staged development. The narrative thread is that humans changed in a series of experiments to a gradual development that kind of got too big for their britches. The Mayan myth is that people were created from corn, which is maize. And he points out, that sounds like, this appealing mythological narrative. It's an origin story, but it's just a story because people don't come from a cob of corn, right? Until you hear this. 20 years ago, the University of Norway and the Max Planck Institute, a name that might ring a bell, the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Germany, discovered an area in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, where many cultivated foods first arrived at the same time. These foods included wheat, barley, peas, lentils, broad beans, chickpeas, grapes, olives, flax, and bitter vetch. That sounds especially appealing. And close by was evidence of the earliest domestication of sheep, pigs, goats, and cattle. And then this director of the archaeobiological program at the Smithsonian said it's a remarkable congruence of plants and animals, all domesticated in a relatively small geographic area very early. A remarkable jackpot. And they go on to say, no one knows who or how this happened. So for the Mayan stories to equate the development of humans with the development of maize, it's a kind of a muddled, confused version of what probably really did happen, that the development of humans and the development of maize all happened at the same time as all these plants did in Mesopotamia and the Mayans. So no one knows who or how this all came about. Was this just one family? It required modification of only 1 or 2 genes to go from a wild plant or a wild animal to a domesticated one. And it's an incredible sudden sequence of technological advances. And this is mainstream science is agreeing with this. The leader of the research team, Manfred Hune, at the University of Norway's Department of Biotechnological Scientists, said to Science magazine in 1997, "I can't prove it, but it's a possibility that one tribe or one family had this idea." And, where'd that come from? So it happened in a very critical recovery period at the end of the last ice age. But remember, all indications of previous civilizations along the coasts are all underwater. After the ice melted, they were underwater. So there were previous civilizations. There were very advanced civilizations like ours. And the question is, were there ones that were as sophisticated as we are, that had been extinguished? And he says, the Clovis Comet did the sorts of, I'm trying to think of the right word, damage that we see now with the results of climate change. All of these may have happened in our long forgotten time. The book of Ecclesiastes says, "What has happened before will happen again. What has been done before will be done again. There is nothing new in the whole world. Look, they say, here is something new, but no, it has all happened before, long before we were born. No one remembers what has happened in the past, and no one in days to come will remember what happens between now and then." And then we have the famous astrophysicist Carl Sagan, skeptic extraordinaire, but not really. "Since in the long run, every planetary civilization will be endangered by impacts from space, every surviving civilization is obliged to become spacefaring, not because of exploratory or romantic zeal, but for the most practical reason imaginable, staying alive. If our long-term survival is at stake, we have a basic responsibility to our species to venture to other worlds. If we admitted that we were that vulnerable, how would this change our behavior? Would we develop space flight with a sense of urgency? Would we share technology globally? Would we improve the quality of life globally? Would we invest more in our relationship with the eternal? So how much technology that you use today? This is a question for everybody right now. And I had to think about this, and my answer was short and sweet. How much technology that you use today could you make from scratch? And I'm here to tell you, I've never been able to build a fire outside successfully. I understand completely what's supposed to be done to get a fire to work. Never been able to do it. Cannot even assemble things that come with instructions. I can't imagine being faced with the daunting task of inventing for myself functional scissors, knives, pins that you could sew with, needles you could sew with. Think about the base, that's technology. Imagine having to make those. Eyeglasses, it boggles the imagination. So archaeology is hinting at a cataclysm that occurred at least once, and a paradigm-shifting human reemergence. And this is not all that unconventional in archaeology anymore. The evidence is becoming a preponderance of evidence. So was there a survival from a near extinction? And how did it happen? Did we have help? The Sumerians, the sky people, the Mayans, the maize people, the Zulu had the goddess that they believed was from the sky. Mabab, I don't want to say it because I'm going to mess it up. It's difficult to pronounce, but trust me on this. So the genetic modification of grain led to the appearance of early civilization after an ice age. So our memory resurfaces in our storytelling. So myth, fiction, history, the lines are pretty blurred. And our ancient creation myths, the tales of ancient trauma. And that's the end of this particular chapter. And I'm going to end the video here. It's the end of number 2. And we'll start with the next video next time. And to finish the book, it may only require one video, maybe a little more. But I thought that next week we could do that, and then we could have a dedicated video to asking the cards about questions that this has all brought to the surface, questions from the Linda Moulton Howe books, and I'm going to raffle off a book. And just to let you know, I am going to do a drawing for Linda Moulton Howe's books, those big books. They're pretty expensive. So moving forward, when I have to get a new book, I'm going to do another plea, more pleas, to get people to donate to buy other books. I've been pretty lucky. I've had kind of a stockpile that I've been working on for quite a long time, because this is like years of years of having books. Some of them were not familiar to me, and they're the ones that I bought. Like, for example, Dolores Cannon. She was new to me fairly. Before I started making my videos, I really she wasn't on my radar. I'd heard her name, and that was it. So yeah, we'll do the drawing next week and give away a book, and we'll do cards as well as finish the book. So we'll have a busy time next week. I hope you're enjoying this. Please give me feedback. Please send me questions. Try to remember to put your questions at the beginning of your comment in large type, and that catches my eye. I try really hard to keep up with the comments, but oftentimes I work, and the Saturday books and conversations with people interfere with me getting to the questions soon enough, and they get lost. If I get enough comments, earlier comments get lost in the scrolling, and it's a nightmare. You should see my emails right now. Oh my God, from Christmas. I won't go into it. And I do have a couple of guests coming up. And I'm not going to say anything, because every time I specifically announce the name, something happens and it has to be delayed. So, remember Dr. Rediker, that lovely person I tortured for so long? So we have a couple of fabulous guests coming up. And send me your questions. Send me your feedback on this book. If you're mad at me for daring to read a book that questions the Bible, then don't bother. I like to maintain an open mind, and I think it's important that we all maintain an open mind. The fear of being questioned is a red flag for me. So thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. Have a good weekend, and it's New Year's. That's right. So Happy New Year, but I'll be back before New Year's Day. And in the meantime, Slán go fóill, slánte.